conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like leather and ambition, and I sat at the far end of the table in a shirt I'd bought at Costco, trying not to smile. My father-in-law didn't know I owned 52% of his company. He didn't know I'd been buying shares quietly for 11 years, through a holding company registered in Delaware, under a name that meant nothing to anyone in that room. He didn't know that the man he'd been calling the factory worker my daughter married had more voting power in Callaway Property Group than he did. He just thought I was there because his daughter had begged him to include me. That was fine. I'd spent 34 years being underestimated by Harold Callaway. I could manage one more afternoon. I met my wife in the spring of 1989. She was volunteering at a food bank in Nashville, stacking canned goods in a storage room that smelled like cardboard and old beans, and she was arguing with the volunteer coordinator about whether the delivery schedule made any logistical sense. She was right. The coordinator knew she was right. Neither of them would back down. I was delivering pallets from a warehouse job I had at the time. I stood in the doorway for about 30 seconds watching her, and that was it for me. I was done. Her name was Beverly. She had her mother's stubbornness and, as I'd learn later, none of her father's patience for people he considered beneath him. We dated for 2 years. I proposed in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel on a Tuesday because we'd had a long drive and she was tired, and I thought, if she says yes right now, half asleep in a parking lot in the rain, then I know she means it. She said yes. Her father did not take the news well. Harold Callaway had built Callaway Property Group from a single strip mall in Murfreesboro into one of the Mid-South's larger commercial real estate operations. By the time Beverly and I got engaged, the company was worth somewhere around $400 million. Harold had a house in Belmead with a circular driveway, a membership at the Country Club of Nashville, and the deep, unshakable conviction that his daughter had made a terrible mistake. He never said it outright. He was too careful for that. Instead, he said things like, "I just want to make sure Beverly has security. And I hope you have a plan, son," with a particular weight on the word son that made it sound like an insult wrapped in politeness. At our wedding rehearsal dinner, held at a restaurant Harold chose and Harold paid for, he gave a toast. He talked about Beverly for 4 minutes. He mentioned me once, to say he hoped I'd rise to the occasion. Beverly squeezed my hand under the table. She thought I was upset. I wasn't. I was already thinking. The first year of our marriage, I was working 2 jobs, days at a manufacturing plant in Smyrna, evenings doing bookkeeping, for 3 small businesses that didn't want to pay for a real accountant. Beverly was teaching 2nd grade. We rented a 2-bedroom house in Murfreesboro for $850 a month, and we were genuinely happy. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling this story as some kind of revenge narrative where I spent 30 years miserable and plotting. That's not what happened. We had a good life. We had Sunday pancakes and a dog named Biscuit who destroyed 2 sofas and 1 section of drywall before we figured out he needed more exercise. We had Beverly's laugh, which was loud and slightly embarrassing in quiet restaurants and which I never once got tired of hearing. What I also had was an eye for numbers and, eventually, a serious amount of patience. The manufacturing plant where I worked had a quality control department, and I spent my lunch breaks reading, not novels, financial statements, annual reports. I'd started buying stock in 1991, small amounts, nothing dramatic, a few shares here, reinvested dividends there. I wasn't trying to get rich. I was just paying attention. By 1997, I'd moved into plant management. By 2001, I'd been recruited into a consulting role that paid well enough that Beverly could cut back to part-time teaching if she wanted to. She didn't want to. She liked her classroom. Harold, when Beverly told him about the consulting job, said, "That's good. Consulting can be volatile, though. I hope he's being careful." Beverly told me this. She thought I'd be annoyed. I said he's not wrong about volatility. She gave me a look. "What?" I said. "You're impossible to rattle," she said. "I'm saving it," I told her. She laughed. She thought I was joking. The first time I bought shares in Callaway Property Group, I was 41 years old. It wasn't a grand plan. I want to be honest about that. I'd been watching the company for years because Beverly sometimes talked about it and because it was an industry I understood. In 2003, Harold had taken the company public, not on a major exchange, a smaller regional offering, and the shares were available if you knew where to look. Most people didn't bother. The company was profitable but unglamorous. Commercial real estate in Tennessee and Kentucky, retail centers, a few office parks, some warehouse space. I bought 2,000 shares through a brokerage account in the name of a holding company I'd set up the year before. My attorney, a man named Clifford who'd been my accountant's college roommate and who I trusted completely, handled the registration. The holding company was called Meridian Stillwater, LLC. It sounded like something that should exist. It meant nothing. Over the next several years, I bought more. Quietly. Never enough at once to trigger disclosure requirements. I was not in a hurry. Harold, meanwhile, continued to find ways to remind me of my place. In 2005, when Beverly and I bought a house, 4 bedrooms in a neighborhood we'd been saving for, Harold toured it and said, "It's a good starter home." We'd been married 16 years. In 2009, when our son Gregory got into Vanderbilt on a merit scholarship, Harold told Beverly, "That's wonderful. He must have gotten your brains." Gregory was standing 6 feet away. I put my hand on my son's shoulder and said, "He got his mother's work ethic and his own everything else." Harold smiled, the smile of a man who'd already stopped listening. In 2011, Beverly's younger brother Randall joined the company. Harold had been grooming Randall for years, not because Randall was particularly talented, though he wasn't without ability, but because Harold had always assumed the company would stay in the family bloodline he recognized as legitimate. That did not include me. By 2014, my position in Callaway Property Group had grown to roughly 31%. I hadn't planned to go further. But then Harold did something that changed my calculation. He pushed Beverly out. Not literally. Beverly had never worked at the company, but she'd inherited a small block of shares from her grandmother, about 4% of total equity, and Harold, through a series of shareholder votes I won't bore you with, managed to dilute that stake significantly. It was technically legal. It was also the most precise message she could have sent. You are not really part of this. Beverly didn't fully understand what had happened. I explained it to her simply, and she was quiet for a long time. "Is there anything to be done?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "but it takes time." She nodded. She trusted me. That was, and remains, the thing I am most grateful for in my life. I called Clifford that evening and told him to start looking for additional seller opportunities in Callaway shares. It took 2 more years. By 2016, I held 52% of the outstanding shares of Callaway Property Group through Meridian Stillwater, LLC. I was, technically, the controlling shareholder of my father-in-law's company. I told no one. Not Beverly, not Gregory, not Clifford's wife, who came to our Christmas party every year and made a cranberry salad that everyone pretended to like. I just waited. The call came on a Thursday in October. Harold's assistant phoned to request my presence at a shareholders' meeting the following week. This was unusual. I'd received annual reports and the occasional proxy notice, always addressed to Meridian Stillwater, never connected to me by name. Harold had no idea who was behind the holding company. Most people never look that hard. I asked Harold's assistant what the meeting was regarding. She said Harold wanted to discuss a transition in company leadership. I thanked her, wrote down the date, and finished eating my lunch. That Sunday, Beverly and I drove out to her parents' house for what had become our monthly obligation. Harold's home was a colonial revival in Belle Meade, the kind of house that had a name. He called it Caldwell House, after some ancestor, with a back porch that overlooked a garden Beverly's mother tended faithfully, and Harold took credit for. Beverly's mother, June, was one of the warmest people I've ever known. She had none of a husband's edge. She met me at the door that first Sunday 32 years ago, and she's met me at the door every Sunday since, and she's never once made me feel like anything other than family. If I'm being honest, she's a significant part of why I stayed patient as long as I did. Dinner that night was roast chicken and green beans from June's garden. Harold sat at the head of the table and talked about a development project in Louisville that was going well, and a political figure he admired and a neighbor whose landscaping he found offensive. Standard Harold. At some point he turned to me and said, "I hear you've been doing some investing." I looked up from my plate. "A bit," I said. "Good for you," he said, in the tone of a man complimenting a child's drawing. "It's good to stay busy in retirement." I had not retired. I was still consulting part-time by choice, but I didn't correct him. "How are the markets treating you?" he asked. Can't complain, I said. He nodded and moved on to the neighbor's landscaping. Beverly, across the table, gave me a small look. She knew I found these evenings trying. She didn't know why I kept my composure as easily as I did. I squeezed her hand under the table. She smiled. The shareholders' meeting was held on a Tuesday at 10 in the morning, in the conference room on the 42nd floor of a building downtown that Harold owned. There were 6 people in the room besides Harold, his CFO, 2 attorneys, a board member named Ted, who I recognized from the annual reports, Randall, and me. Randall saw me come in and went noticeably still. He didn't know who Meridian Stillwater was either. He'd worked alongside that holding company's voting record for years without curiosity. I sat at the far end of the table. I brought Clifford. I introduced him as my advisor. Harold acknowledged this with a nod and moved on. Harold opened the meeting himself, which he preferred. He talked about the company's performance over the past fiscal year. Revenue was up slightly, but the portfolio needed modernization. He had concerns about certain legacy assets. He believed this was a pivotal moment. Then he said he wanted to discuss succession. He intended, he explained, to begin transitioning the CEO role to Randall within 18 months. He'd like the board's support, and he'd like the backing of the major shareholders. He looked around the room at the assembled parties. I watched him not look at me. I'd been invisible in that room for so long that I don't think it even occurred to him to wonder why Meridian Stillwater had sent a representative. One of the attorneys mentioned that they'd need to formally notify all shareholders above a certain threshold. Harold said yes. Naturally, that had been done. He was looking at Ted when he said it. Clifford, next to me, set a document on the table. "Excuse me," I said. Harold turned. "I have a question about the succession vote," I said. "What threshold of shareholder approval does the board require?" Harold frowned slightly. "Majority of outstanding shares," he said. "Standard procedure." "I see," I said. "And Meridian Stillwater's position would be relevant to that calculation." There was a pause. Harold looked at one of his attorneys. The attorney looked at the documents in front of him. "Meridian Stillwater holds approximately 52% of outstanding shares," the attorney said. The room went quiet. Harold looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not the full understanding, not yet, but the first edge of it, like a man who hears a sound in a dark house and isn't sure what it is yet. "That's correct," Clifford said. He slid the document across the table toward Harold's end. "My client is the beneficial owner of Meridian Stillwater, LLC. He's held this position for approximately 9 years. Harold picked up the document. He put it down. He picked it up again. The sound in the dark house had become very loud. "You," he said. He was looking at me. "Just that. You." "Yes," I said. "I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. Not triumph, exactly. It wasn't hot or sharp, the way I'd imagined it might be, years ago when I was younger and angrier. It was quieter than that. Something closer to relief. The kind of feeling you get when you've been holding a door closed against the wind for a very long time, and you finally decide it's safe to let go." Randall said, "What does this mean?" "It means," Clifford said, "that my client controls the succession vote, among other governance matters." Harold set the document on the table very carefully. He had the look of a man rearranging something inside himself, finding new positions for things he'd thought were settled. "Why?" he said. Still to me. "Why did you never?" "Because it wasn't time," I said. We talked for 3 hours. Harold's attorneys and Clifford went back and forth. There was a break, during which Harold stood at the window for a long time without speaking. June called Beverly's phone during the break to ask if we were coming for dinner that night, and I listened to Beverly say she wasn't sure. She'd explain later. I did not come to that room to destroy anything. I want to be clear about that, and I want it on record, for whatever record this is. I had no interest in dismantling the company. I had no interest in removing Harold, who was 73 years old and, whatever his faults, had built something that employed several hundred people in 3 states. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the 4% that had been diluted away from Beverly to be restored to her. I wanted her name on something her grandfather had helped build. I wanted Harold to look at his daughter and understand that she had not married down, that she had married a man who saw her clearly, who believed in her completely, and who had quietly patiently, over 30 years, turned nothing into something significant. I also had some thoughts about Randall. Randall was not incompetent, but he was not ready, and more importantly, he'd spent his career in the assumption of inheritance rather than the work of earning. I wasn't going to block him permanently. I proposed a 3-year development plan with specific benchmarks and external board oversight before any transition of the CEO role. Harold's attorneys pushed back. Clifford held the line. Harold was quiet through most of this. When he spoke, it was measured in a way I'd never heard from him before. At one point he said, "You've been waiting a long time." "I wasn't waiting," I said. "I was watching." He looked at me for a moment. "Is there a difference?" "Waiting is what you do when you're hoping for something," I said. "I wasn't hoping. I was building." He was quiet again. Before we left, I said one more thing. I said it directly, without Clifford, just the two of us standing near the elevator while the attorneys gathered their papers. "I've loved your daughter since a parking lot in 1991, I said. "I've never needed your approval to do that. But I would like you to understand, before too much more time passes, that she has been taken care of. That she has always been taken care of. That she has always been taken care of." Harold looked at the floor. Then he looked at me. "I underestimated you," he said. It sounded like it cost him something. "I know," I said. I told Beverly that night. We sat at the kitchen table after dinner with decaf coffee, the way we do, the way we've done for years, the kitchen table being the place in our house where everything real gets said. And I told her everything. The holding company, the shares, the year I'd started buying, the year I'd crossed 50%. She didn't say anything for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked. "I'd thought about this answer for years." "Because you would have told me to do something with it sooner," I said. "You would have wanted to fix it faster, and I didn't want to fix it faster. I wanted it to be right." She looked at me over her coffee cup. "That's the most aggravating explanation I've ever heard." "I know," I said. "Is it done now?" "Mostly." She put her cup down. She looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where we'd watched 3 dogs live out their lives over the years, and where the garden, I was never any good at, still somehow grew things. Then she looked back at me. "You know what bothers me most," she said. "Tell me." "That you carried that for so long by yourself." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You carried everything else," I said. She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. "We're going to have a very strange Thanksgiving this year." We did. Harold was subdued in a way none of his grandchildren had ever seen, which made the grandchildren nervous and gave June, who I suspect had known Harold needed to be humbled for at least 20 years, a look of deep, private satisfaction that she did an admirable job of concealing. Randall passed the dinner rolls and asked me 2 careful questions about the company's portfolio strategy that he'd never have asked before. I answered them genuinely. He listened. He might be all right eventually. People ask me sometimes, though not many people know the full story, whether it was worth it. 30-some years of patience, of letting Harold's small cuts land without bleeding in front of him, of building something invisible while the world assumed I had nothing. I find the question strange, honestly. There was never a sacrifice. I wasn't grinding through unhappy years toward a moment of victory. I had a wife who loved me, kids who turned out well, a dog who always knew when I was tired. I had work I was good at. I had a kitchen table and a cup of decaf and someone to sit across from in the mornings. The money was always just a tool, a way to make sure that what mattered was protected. That's all I ever wanted it to be. Harold came to my 62nd birthday dinner last year. He sat next to me at the table. He didn't say much, but at the end of the night, when people were putting on coats and finding their keys, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I understood him completely. After 34 years, that was, I suppose, the most honest thing he'd ever told me. The drive home, Beverly fell asleep in the passenger seat 20 minutes outside of Nashville, the way she always does on long drives, her head against the window, a slight smile that doesn't mean anything except that she's comfortable. I drove the rest of the way in the dark with the radio low. That was enough. That has always been enough. I think about that drive home a lot. Beverly asleep in the passenger seat, head against the window, that small, unconscious smile. The radio low, the highway dark and quiet all the way back to Nashville. Nothing dramatic happened in that car. No one said anything important. And yet, it's the moment I come back to when I try to explain what any of this was actually for. Harold spent 34 years deciding what kind of man I was based on what I drove and where I worked and how I dressed. That's not unusual. People do that. We all build pictures of each other from the outside in. And sometimes those pictures are so comfortable that we stop looking for new information. Harold stopped looking for new information about me around 1993, and he never really started again. That wasn't malice exactly. It was something smaller and sadder than malice. It was assumption. An assumption, left long enough, hardens into certainty, and certainty is the end of curiosity. What I learned, not from Harold, but from watching what his assumptions cost him, is that the most dangerous thing a person can do is stop being curious about the people closest to them. He had a daughter he never fully saw. He had a son-in-law he never bothered to understand. He built a company and ran it with intelligence and discipline, and he applied almost none of that same discipline to the question of who the people in his life actually were. I don't say this to condemn him. I say it because I made my own version of that mistake. I kept Beverly in the dark for 11 years. I told myself it was strategy, that I was protecting her from something she'd want to act on too quickly. And there was truth in that. But there was also something else. Something I had to be honest with myself about afterward. I liked being the one who knew. I liked carrying it quietly. And that kind of quiet, the kind that keeps things from the person you love most, is not patience. It's a different kind of assumption. It's assuming you know better than they do what they can handle. She forgave me for that. Beverly has always been more generous than I deserve. What I believe, looking back at all of it, is that the things that actually protected our life were never the shares in a Delaware holding company. They were smaller than that and harder to build. They were the discipline to keep working when I was tired, the honesty to admit, eventually, when I'd been wrong, the decision, made quietly and renewed every day for 34 years, to be someone Beverly could trust completely, not because it served a strategy, but because it was right. Those are the things that compound, not stock, character. The willingness to do the difficult thing without an audience, the patience to let something develop at the pace it needs to develop, the integrity to make sure that when the moment finally comes, you can look at what you built and say, I didn't cut corners to get here. I didn't become something I wasn't. I just showed up over and over, and I did the work. Harold put his hand on my shoulder at my 62nd birthday and said nothing. I understood him. What he was saying without words was, I see you now. That was enough. After 34 years, a hand on a shoulder and a coat closet was enough. I think that's the whole story, actually. Not the shares, not the conference room, not the document sliding across the table. The whole story is be worth seeing. Be patient enough to let people arrive at the truth on their own terms, and trust that the life you build in the quiet, ordinary, unheroic days, the pancake sundaes, the decaf at the kitchen table, the passenger seat at midnight, is the only foundation that actually holds.